February 1943. In the cracked deserts of Tunisia, under a sun that burned like judgment itself, a German patrol brought back something strange from the battlefield, an American tank. Its name, hastily painted across the hull, read, War Daddy II. It was a prize of war, but also an insult in steel. For the men of the Reich, who believed their machines were the finest ever built, this captured Sherman would become the most unsettling mirror they had ever faced. What began as a routine inspection would evolve into a slow, humiliating revelation that their proudest creations were fragile where the enemies were faithful. When the tank was driven 350 kilometers across the North African desert to the port of Sfax, it never faltered. No overheating, no breakdowns, no complaints. The German engineers who escorted it began to feel something they had never known before, a creeping doubt. Their panzers, symbols of power and precision, could not have survived such a journey. The American machine simply kept going, as if it didn't know how to stop. By the time it was loaded onto a ship bound for Germany, the men weren't just moving a tank. They were carrying home the first crack in their nation's belief in its own perfection. In Berlin, the tank would be dissected by the sharpest minds of the Reich, engineers who had grown up worshipping precision like a religion. They would open the Sherman expecting to find crude shortcuts, primitive mechanisms, something to mock. Instead, they found a philosophy that terrified them, simplicity that worked, design that forgave, machinery built not for pride, but for endurance. What they discovered at Kummersdorf would quietly destroy a century of German industrial certainty. They had built masterpieces too delicate for war. The Americans had built tools that survived it. And as the German engineers would soon learn in modern warfare, reliability is not a virtue. It is the difference between victory and extinction. February 1943. In the blinding desert of Tunisia, the war had already burned away illusions of invincibility. The German army, once feared as an unstoppable machine, now moved through a wasteland of dust, exhaustion, and doubt. Their engines coughed, their vehicles groaned under the weight of the sand, and their faith in mechanical superiority began to erode, one gear at a time. Then, as if by irony itself, a single American tank rolled out of the smoke, intact, unbroken, alive. Its name, written in white across the green hull, was War Daddy II, and it would quietly destroy what was left of German pride. The men of Panzer Battalion 501 stood around the captured machine like priests before an unholy idol. The desert heat shimmered over its curves, its paint still marked with the faded white star of the enemy. It wasn't supposed to survive. American machines were supposed to be clumsy, overbuilt, and weak. That was what they had been told by their officers, by propaganda, by the unshakable belief in German precision. Yet here it stood, dusty but defiant, its engine still warm. One officer touched the armor and felt the hum of reliability beneath the steel. It was not the hum of perfection, but of endurance. They tried to mock it at first. They joked about its shape, its simplicity, its lack of elegance. But mockery turned into silence when they tried to start it. And it started at once, purring like a satisfied animal. The same men who had cursed the unreliability of their panzers watched in disbelief as this foreign tank, built by hands they had dismissed as crude, rolled forward without protest. They drove it through the dunes, through heat that would make their own tanks falter, and still it did not fail. It did not even hesitate. From Sidi Bouzid to Sfax, a journey of 350 kilometers, the tank crossed the desert like a pilgrim of endurance. The Germans who accompanied it began to whisper. Some said it was luck, others superstition. But those who truly understood machines felt something deeper, the quiet horror of realizing that the enemy had built something they could not. Each kilometer was a confession. Each flawless turn of the tracks was a reminder that German engineering, as proud and precise as it was, had never truly mastered reliability. The tank's journey was recorded in notebooks, photographs, and whispered reports. Officers noted that the engine did not overheat, not once. The transmission ran smooth. The final drives, the weak point of so many German designs, never faltered. And the fuel consumption, it was steady, predictable, dependable. German mechanics had learned to live with the sound of failure, broken clutches, cracked gear teeth, smoking radiators. But this American machine moved as if the laws of wear and friction simply did not apply to it. One sergeant wrote later in his logbook, "The Americans build their tanks as if they expect them to be mistreated, and yet they survive. We build ours as if they must be worshipped, and they betray us." It was more than an observation. It was an omen. By the time War Daddy II reached the port of Sfax, even the most loyal officers were quiet. The tank had covered a distance no German vehicle could have managed without repair. Mechanics inspected it again, expecting to find some hidden flaw. They found none. Every bolt held firm, every component performed as if it were new. There was something insulting about it, this idea that reliability could be achieved through simplicity, that mass production could produce perfection. For engineers raised on the gospel of precision, this was blasphemy. Orders came from Berlin. The tank was to be shipped to Germany immediately, intact. It would be studied, tested, dissected at the proving grounds of Kummersdorf, the sacred heart of German engineering. The officers who watched it being loaded onto the cargo ship did not cheer. They looked at it as one might look at a captured beast, dangerous not because of its power, but because of what it revealed about themselves. On the long voyage north, the German escort officers argued quietly in the mess. One insisted the American tank's success was a fluke. Another claimed it was the product of sheer quantity, that any nation which built 10,000 tanks could afford a few good ones. But the eldest among them, an engineer from Bavaria, said nothing until the end of the meal. When he finally spoke, his words silenced the table. "Gentlemen, if the Americans can make even one of these by the thousand, then we have already lost." When the ship arrived at the port of Naples and continued toward Germany, word spread through the armaments ministry. A working Sherman, captured, complete. It became a whispered legend before it even reached Kummersdorf. Some officers dismissed it as unimportant. Others were terrified, because deep down beneath the slogans and the superiority complex, the German war machine had begun to sense its own mortality. The Panzer dream, the idea of invincible German craftsmanship, was beginning to rust. The Sherman was not elegant, it did not intimidate, but it functioned. And in war, function is victory. As reports of its flawless performance circulated, the German engineers grew restless. They could outgun the enemy. They could outthink him. But could they outlast him? The question hung over every test, every meeting, every whispered conversation in Kummersdorf's halls. The psychological shift was subtle, but irreversible. For years, Germany had defined itself through mastery, the belief that complexity meant superiority, that precision was a kind of moral truth. But now, this captured tank from across the ocean challenged everything they believed about engineering, about industry, about themselves. If the American tank could endure more with less, what did that say about German genius? Was their brilliance, in the end, their greatest weakness? As War Daddy II rolled onto German soil, covered in North African dust, it carried more than steel and oil. It carried humiliation, quiet, mechanical, undeniable. And perhaps somewhere deep in the minds of those who watched it arrive, it also carried a warning that wars are not won by the most complex machines, but by the most reliable ones. That sometimes the simplest design hides the deepest intelligence. When the engineers at Kummersdorf prepared to examine it, they did not yet know that the next months would break something far more fragile than a transmission or an axle. They would break belief itself. The Sherman would expose the flaw not in metal, but in mentality, the flaw of a nation that mistook perfection for strength and found itself defeated by a machine that simply refused to stop. And so, on that cold morning when the train carrying War Daddy II rolled through Brandenburg, the engineers gathered at the station, their notebooks ready, their pride carefully arranged. They did not cheer, they did not smile. They only stared at the tank as it passed, a machine from another world, one that did not care about ideology, philosophy, or national pride. It only cared about running, and it ran perfectly. They could not have known it then, but the hum of that American engine was the sound of the future. And for those who listened closely, it was also the sound of everything they had believed, beginning to die. When War Daddy II arrived at Kummersdorf, the heart of Germany's military testing grounds, it entered not just a facility, but a mindset. Behind those iron gates stood the pride of German science, engineers who believed they were the best in the world, guardians of mechanical purity. They had built machines of terrifying power and beauty, tanks that symbolized order, precision, and control. To them, the Sherman was nothing but a foreign curiosity, an industrial mistake shaped by a crude nation obsessed with mass production. Yet within hours of their inspection, those same engineers would begin to question everything they had ever believed about engineering, power, and purpose. The tank was rolled into the testing bay, its olive-green armor scarred from desert sand. German engineers circled it like surgeons around an unknown organism. They spoke in clipped tones, their pens scratching across clipboards as they measured every bolt, every weld, every seam. To them, the machine looked primitive. The welds were not elegant, the armor joints seemed rough. There was no artistry, no aesthetic pride. One young engineer whispered, "It looks carelessly built." His superior, an older man with a steel-rimmed monocle, replied, "Then let us see how carelessness performs under pressure." They began the examination. The Sherman's hatches were opened, revealing an interior that seemed almost insultingly simple. The gear, a transmission, accessible with only a few bolts removed. The engine compartment, wide and clean. The control levers, light and intuitive. For men trained to worship complexity, this was heresy. They believed quality meant difficulty, that mastery could only be proven through struggle. But the Sherman defied that belief. Everything inside it seemed designed for a soldier, not an engineer. It was not a machine to be admired from a distance. It was a machine meant to serve. As the tests began, something unexpected happened. The tank ran smoothly. The gears shifted easily. The steering responded without effort, and it kept running, hour after hour, without the usual stops for adjustments or cooling. The engineers frowned, confused. They were accustomed to mechanical complaints, the overheating Maybach engines, the delicate transmissions that cracked under stress, the endless tinkering their own tanks demanded. But this foreign machine refused to complain. It simply worked. An observer from the Armaments Ministry wrote in his notes, "It runs like a sewing machine. How strange. How un-German." For a moment, the silence in the testing hangar felt heavy. Some men hid their surprise behind cold professionalism. Others looked angry, as if betrayed by their own craft. It was not just a technical failure they felt. It was emotional. The Sherman's success whispered something dangerous, that the German obsession with perfection might not be strength but weakness. It was as if a student, proud of his complex equations, suddenly realized the man beside him had solved the same problem with a single line. One engineer, named Reinhardt, kept watching the transmission tests. The Sherman's gears used a herringbone pattern, stronger, smoother, forgiving of small errors in manufacturing. In Germany, such gears were considered too costly, too difficult to produce at scale. Yet here they were, working flawlessly. Reinhardt later wrote in his private notebook, "We did not fail because we knew less. We failed because we built for our own vanity." Outside the testing halls, workers and soldiers began whispering stories about the American tank. They said it could drive for days without stopping, that its engine never overheated, that it was easy enough for a farmer to drive. For people living through shortages, hunger, and the chaos of bombing raids, these stories felt almost mythical. Ordinary Germans could not help but draw comparisons to their daily lives. The endless repairs, the scarcity of parts, the constant struggle to keep things running. The Sherman was not just a tank, it was a symbol of something that worked. In a country where even trains ran late from bombing and factories constantly broke down, that idea had power. It's strange how machines can reflect the spirit of the people who build them. The Sherman reflected practicality, teamwork, and trust in the ordinary worker. The German tanks reflected pride, individual brilliance, and control. The difference wasn't only mechanical, it was philosophical. The Americans built for survival. The Germans built for superiority. But war, as it turned out, rewarded the ones who could keep moving when everything else was falling apart. One evening, after a long day of testing, an engineer stayed late in the hangar. He sat on the fender of the Sherman, looking at its dull armor under the flickering light. He thought about the young soldiers freezing in Russia, trying to repair Panthers buried in snow, their engines dead, their transmissions cracked. He thought about his own brother, who had written from the Eastern Front, saying their tanks spent more time being fixed than fighting. And now here was this American machine, a tank that seemed immune to despair. He whispered to himself, if only ours could be this. Simple, This alive. There was irony in that moment. A German engineer envying the soul of an American machine. Weeks passed. The tests continued. The Sherman climbed hills, crossed obstacles, endured punishment, and still performed. The engineers began to argue among themselves. Some said it was luck. Others admitted admiration. A few denied the evidence entirely, retreating into ideology. "Our tanks are works of art," one senior officer shouted during a heated meeting. This thing is a tractor." But another quietly replied, "Yes, and tractors do not stop." The room fell silent. The reports went to Berlin. The results were clear. The Sherman outlasted German vehicles in endurance and stability. Its systems were simpler to repair, its parts easier to replace, its operation accessible to any trained soldier. The engineers were ordered to continue the tests, but in private, many of them knew the truth. They were studying their own defeat. The contrast between German and American design began to haunt their conversations. The German tanks, with their finely tuned engines and intricate components, required constant attention, like an aristocrat demanding servants. The Sherman, in contrast, was like a loyal worker, not beautiful, not graceful, but always ready. In a strange way, it embodied something deeply democratic, strength through simplicity, success through cooperation. If you have ever fixed something at home, a car, a bicycle, a computer, you understand this feeling. The tool that works easily, that forgives your mistakes, feels like an ally. The one that demands perfection punishes you for being human. The Germans built their tanks for engineers. The Americans built theirs for men. And that simple truth echoed through every kilometer the Sherman drove without braking. The engineers at Kummersdorf began to feel the emotional weight of their discovery. They weren't just testing a tank. They were testing the limits of their own national philosophy. Could something built for the common man truly outperform the masterpieces of their greatest minds? Could a nation that valued simplicity and mass production defeat one that worshipped precision and control? Each successful test of the Sherman felt like an answer they didn't want to hear. One report, written by a senior engineer, ended with a sentence that would never be published in official records. "The enemy's strength is not his machines, but his belief that everyone has the right to make them." It was a quiet admission that the war Germany was fighting was not just lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the factory, in the mind, and in the heart. If you've ever wondered why history remembers some machines and forgets others, it's because machines carry meaning beyond their metal. The Sherman carried the idea that reliability is not a luxury, it's a promise. A promise that when things break, you can fix them. When the road ends, you can keep going. When life becomes chaos, you can still depend on something to move forward. And that promise, in war or peace, is more powerful than perfection. As the engineers packed up for the day, they couldn't escape the sound of the Sherman's engine, still idling softly in the distance. It was calm, steady, almost reassuring, a heartbeat in steel. They knew that somewhere in that rhythm was the future of warfare, and perhaps the future of the world. Before you continue to the next chapter of this story, take a moment to think about what that realization means. The men at Kummersdorf didn't just test a machine. They confronted the uncomfortable truth that winning requires humility, not pride. And that lesson, though born in war, belongs to all of us. So if you want to keep exploring these forgotten truths, these echoes of history that still shape our world, click the red button somewhere in the corner of your screen. Subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering how defeat can teach what victory never could. June 1943. The Kummersdorf proving ground was alive with motion and tension. The air smelled of oil and rain-soaked earth, the hum of engines echoing like distant thunder. Soldiers, officers, and engineers gathered near the track for what had been announced as a great demonstration of German armored superiority. Among the assembled machines stood the new Panther, sleek and deadly, a masterpiece of engineering meant to restore pride. Next to it loomed the massive Ferdinand tank destroyer, a symbol of unstoppable power, and beside them, smaller, humbler, stood the captured American Sherman, the same war daddy too that had crossed the desert without breaking. No one knew that. Before the day was over, this foreign machine would wound Germany's pride deeper than any bomb or bullet ever could. The test began under an overcast sky. Engines roared, treads bit into mud, and the smell of exhaust filled the air. The Panther moved first, graceful but tense, its 700 horsepower Maybach engine straining with each shift. The Sherman followed, its engine purring steadily, almost quietly, climbing the same incline without fuss or hesitation. The crowd murmured. Then came the Ferdinand, a steel beast that weighed 65 tons. It started strong, then hesitated, then stopped. Steam hissed. Its massive bulk sat frozen halfway up the slope as officers exchanged uneasy glances. Among them was Albert Speer, the Reich's Minister of Armaments, a man tasked with keeping Hitler's dreams of technological dominance alive. He watched in silence as recovery crews struggled to restart the Ferdinand. The embarrassment was unbearable. The Sherman, the inferior foreign machine, had succeeded where Germany's proudest creations had failed. Speer said nothing, but those near him saw his face harden, a silent recognition that something fundamental was wrong. In his notes that night, he would write that the Americans had achieved something Germany never truly mastered: reliability. How does pride survive when truth stands in front of it, undeniable and mechanical? The engineers who watched that test asked themselves the same question. For years they had believed that complexity was power, that beauty in engineering equaled superiority. But now simplicity had won. The Sherman did not look noble, it did not sound fierce, yet when tested, it endured. Could it be that the war Germany was fighting wasn't just on the battlefield, but inside the very definition of what progress meant? Reports from that day traveled fast. Newspapers described the event carefully, wrapping the truth in propaganda. Das Reich published an article praising the Sherman as a remarkable product of the North American steel industry. The words were diplomatic, almost complimentary, but behind them lay fear. Every engineer at Kummersdorf understood what those polite sentences really meant. The Americans had found a way to build excellence without obsession. Days later, discussions erupted inside the Ministry of Armaments. Some argued that the demonstration had been unfair, that the German tanks were too new, their systems not fully refined. Others defended the results, warning that denying the truth would only make it worse. One senior officer stood and said what many were too proud to admit: "Gentlemen, we are building monuments. The Americans are building machines." The silence that followed was the sound of realization, the kind that changes everything but too late. The following weeks at Kummersdorf felt strange. The engineers continued their tests on War Daddy 2, but now the mood was different. There was no more laughter at the tank's simple design, no more sarcastic comments about American factory toys. Instead, there was quiet fascination and a growing sense of envy. They discovered that the transmission gears were made with methods Germany had abandoned years earlier, believing them too crude. The suspension system, so unrefined to the eye, handled rough ground better than the Panther's sophisticated torsion bars. Every bolt, every weld seemed to mock their pursuit of technical perfection, and with every discovery, another piece of their confidence eroded. Have you ever believed in something so deeply that reality itself had to break it for you? That was the feeling spreading through Kummersdorf. The German engineers had been raised to believe that difficulty proved genius. But the Sherman whispered a different truth, that intelligence is not how much complexity you create, but how much simplicity you can sustain. It was a truth too heavy for many to bear. The contrast between belief and evidence began to eat at them. Letters from the front reached Kummersdorf, describing Panthers breaking down before reaching battle, Tigers stranded from final drive failures, crews abandoning vehicles that could not move. The reports read like confessions of defeat, disguised as logistics. Each one reinforced what the engineers were witnessing. Firsthand, Germany was losing not because its machines were weaker, but because they demanded too much from men who had too little left to give. One evening, a young engineer named Vogel stayed late in the testing yard. The Sherman sat quietly in the fading light, its metal warm from a day of trials. Vogel placed his hand on the armor and felt the faint vibration of the engine cooling. He thought of his father, a machinist who had once told him, "The best tools are the ones that forgive you." The words struck him now with painful clarity. The German tanks were not forgiving. They punished their users. The Sherman, somehow, seemed to understand the chaos of war and adapt to it. Vogel realized then that the Americans had built something not for engineers, but for human beings. What happens to a nation when it learns that its greatness has been built on the wrong idea? That question haunted the men of Kummersdorf. They began to see the Sherman not as an enemy's weapon, but as a messenger from a different world, a world where machines existed to serve, not to be worshipped. It was a quiet, unsettling revelation that made them question their own purpose. If a tank built for the common soldier could outperform their sacred designs, then what else about their beliefs was wrong? By late summer, rumors spread that the Führer himself had been briefed on the Sherman's test results. The engineers never saw the report that reached him, but they heard whispers. Hitler had dismissed the findings as irrelevant, insisting that German superiority lay in spirit, not machinery. Yet even his denial carried an undercurrent of fear, deep. Inside the machinery of the Reich, doubt was spreading like oil through an engine, slow, invisible, unstoppable. The Sherman kept running. It crossed mud, climbed hills, endured stress tests that should have broken it. Every time it finished a trial, the Germans ran another, more punishing one. It was as if they were trying to make it fail, trying to reclaim their pride by proving that everything has a breaking point. But the tank refused to break. The harder they pushed, the more it seemed to expose their frustration. It became symbolic of something larger than itself, a quiet defiance against a nation obsessed with perfection. And then came the unexpected twist. One morning, as the engineers prepared for another round of tests, they found that one of their own tanks, a Panther prototype, had suffered a mechanical failure overnight. A cracked gearbox again. In frustration, one of the senior engineers ordered the Sherman to tow it back to the maintenance shed. It did so effortlessly. The sight was unbearable. The American tank, a prisoner of war, was rescuing Germany's pride. No one spoke as it passed. The humiliation was complete. Sometimes truth reveals itself not with noise but with silence. The silence of men who realize that the world they built no longer makes sense. Kummersdorf became that silence. The engineers continued their duties, wrote their reports, but something had changed. In their eyes, they had seen the limits of their perfection. They had seen the power of practicality, and though they would never say it aloud, they knew. The Americans had already won something greater than a battle. They had won the future. The story of that day, of that quiet test field outside Berlin, did not make headlines. But in the memory of those who were there, it marked the moment when pride began to surrender to truth. And perhaps that surrender was the beginning of wisdom. The kind that only comes after everything you believe in has been proven wrong. By late 1943, the truth could no longer be hidden behind the smoke of propaganda or the pride of old engineers. The reports coming out of Kummersdorf were cold and statistical, stripped of emotion but heavy with meaning. The Sherman, the tank that the Germans had once dismissed as crude and unrefined, outperformed their own machines in every measurable way. Where the Tiger and Panther averaged 150 kilometers before major mechanical failure, the Sherman averaged nearly 600. Where German tanks needed complex maintenance after each battle, the Sherman needed little more than oil and fuel. It was not faster, it was not stronger, but it lasted longer, and in a war that consumed men and machines, faster than they could be replaced, longevity was the deadliest weapon of all. The engineers tried to rationalize it. They said that the Americans had more factories, more resources, more steel, and it was true. By 1943, the United States was producing more than 8,000 tanks per month, while Germany struggled to assemble a few hundred. But even this fact failed to explain why the American machines worked better. In the ruins of their logic, a darker realization began to grow. The enemy's strength was not just in numbers, but in philosophy. The Americans built for soldiers. The Germans built for spectacle. The internal memos from the armaments office reflected a growing panic disguised as analysis. One report concluded, American equipment reflects a mentality of mechanical democracy. Every part may be replaced, every man may operate, every error may be forgiven. It was not meant as a praise, but it sounded like one. Another report quietly admitted that the German war effort could not sustain its own complexity. Spare parts for Tigers were taking months to produce. Factories were bombed, supply lines were strangled. Even when tanks reached the front, many broke down before seeing combat. The data painted a brutal picture. Of every 10 German tanks built, 6 were lost to mechanical failure, not battle. In contrast, American and British tanks remained operational 3 times longer. On the Eastern Front, the situation was even worse. Temperatures below 20 degrees froze the delicate engines of German vehicles. Oil thickened, transmissions cracked, hydraulics failed. The Sherman, in comparison, started every time. Soviet reports from captured units described the American tank as indifferent to the cold. The German engineers who read these reports felt both disbelief and envy. How could a machine so simple endure? Conditions that shattered their precision. By early 1944, the Reich's industry was collapsing under its own perfectionism. The Panther, designed as a symbol of mechanical superiority, became a nightmare to manufacture. Each one required more than 150,000 man-hours to build, and still, 40% left the factory with defects. The Tiger II was even worse. Its sheer weight destroyed its own drivetrain, its transmission failed every 30 hours, and it guzzled fuel that no longer existed. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American assembly lines built Shermans at a rhythm that seemed impossible, one every 20 minutes. Each one rolled off the line, ready for war. Interchangeable, maintainable, replaceable. Germany built masterpieces. America built momentum. Inside Kummersdorf, the mood turned grim. Engineers still performed tests on War Daddy II, but now their data was shadowed by desperation. They knew that no redesign could fix what was broken in their ideology. Even when they copied elements of the Sherman, its wider tolerances, its modular systems, they could not replicate its spirit. The machine was not just a product of industry, it was a reflection of a culture that valued function over glory, teamwork over pride. As the Allies advanced west through France, the engineers received new field reports that struck like physical blows. The Normandy landings had flooded Europe with thousands of Shermans. They were not invincible. German guns destroyed many, but for every Sherman lost, 2 more arrived. The battlefield became a living example of industrial inevitability. German tank crews began referring to them bitterly as iron locusts. Yet in private, some admitted a grudging respect. The Sherman might burn, but before it did, it always fought back. When German soldiers captured, destroyed Shermans, they were shocked by what they found inside. Comfort. The seats were padded. The controls were labeled. The ventilation worked. A small heater was installed to prevent frostbite. These were details that seemed trivial until men realized how much they mattered. A crew that could breathe, rest, and move easily could fight longer. The Sherman was not just a tank, it was a human machine. At the same time, American crews began to form emotional bonds with their vehicles. They named them, painted them, personalized them. Death Dealer, Thunderbolt, Doris. The Sherman became more than metal, it became identity. German soldiers, in contrast, treated their machines with reverence and fear. The Panther was not a companion, it was a burden. The Tiger was a weapon, but also a cage. When something broke, it required a team of specialists to fix it. When the Sherman broke, a single mechanic could do the job in an hour. As 1944 turned to 1945, the statistics became unbearable. The Luftwaffe had lost control of the skies, and Allied bombers reduced German cities to rubble. Factories that once produced Panzers now stood in ruins. In January 1945, Germany managed to produce only 436 tanks. The United States produced more than 2,500. Numbers alone told the story, but the deeper truth lay in philosophy. Germany had built machines that could not survive the imperfection of war. America had built machines that accepted imperfection as part of life. The engineers who had once mocked the Sherman now watched their own creations burn in the fields of France and Poland. They began to collect what little data they could from the wreckage. Some even wrote private letters to their Allied counterparts after the war, expressing admiration. One such letter, found years later in archives, read, "Your tank was not beautiful, but it was honest. Ours were built for gods. Yours were built for men." The collapse of the German tank program mirrored the collapse of the Reich itself. By the spring of 1945, as Soviet troops advanced toward Berlin, Kummersdorf fell silent. The laboratories were emptied. The engineers destroyed their records or fled. War Daddy II was left behind, still operational. It had survived every test, every inspection, every humiliation inflicted upon it. When Soviet soldiers entered the compound, they found it parked neatly beside a destroyed Tiger. The symbolism was so perfect, that some thought it must have been deliberate, and yet even as the empire crumbled, something extraordinary was happening in the minds of those same German engineers. For the first time, they began to see failure as a form of education. They realized that the future would not belong to those who built the most complex machines, but to those who built the most reliable ones. This was the beginning of a new idea, the philosophy that would later define post-war German engineering. After the war, many of these engineers found work in reconstruction projects. Some were brought to the United States, others stayed in what would become West Germany. The lessons of Kummersdorf did not die. They transformed. The engineers who had tested the Sherman applied what they had learned to civilian industries. The same men who once built weapons began designing cars, tools, and machines for peace. The post-war German miracle, the rise of Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and Siemens, was born from the ashes of this humiliation. The obsession with precision remained, but it was now tempered by practicality. Perfection had learned to serve reliability. Meanwhile, the Sherman itself became a legend, though not for its beauty or power. It fought in every theater of war, from North Africa to Normandy, from Italy to the Pacific. By 1945, more than 49,000 had been built. It was not the best tank in the world, but it was the right one for its time. Its greatest strength was not its gun or armor, but its ability to be there, everywhere, all the time. It embodied the industrial and moral resilience that ultimately crushed the Axis powers. Unexpectedly, the Sherman's influence extended far beyond the war. In the decades that followed, it became a tool for rebuilding nations. Many were sold or donated to countries rebuilding their armies. Some were converted for civilian use. In Israel, Shermans were still being used and modified as late as the 1960s. The machine that once symbolized defeat for Germany became a teacher for the new world order it helped create. When historians look back, they see the Sherman not as a triumph of technology, but as a triumph of philosophy. It proved that greatness in design does not come from brilliance alone, but from understanding human limits. It taught that progress is not measured by precision, but by purpose. And in a quiet, paradoxical way, it also saved German engineering from itself. The lessons learned from its defeat became the foundation of a new kind of excellence, one rooted in humility. For those who lived through it, the memory of that captured Sherman never faded. To the German engineers, it was a ghost, a reminder of the day their pride was dismantled piece by piece. To the world, it was proof that even in war, truth emerges not from power, but from endurance. War Daddy 2 may have been just one tank among thousands, but its journey, from the deserts of Tunisia to the heart of Germany, was more than history. It was a story about what happens when a nation finally meets the limits of its own perfection and begins, painfully, to learn. When the war ended in 1945, Europe was not a continent of victors. It was a continent of survivors. The flags that waved over the ruins could not hide the truth written in ashes. Cities were gone, families erased, ideologies shattered. And among the ruins of Germany, in places like Kummersdorf and Peenemünde, the men who had once built engines of war stood silently beside the wreckage of their own convictions. For them, defeat was no longer a political event. It was a moral awakening. They had built machines that embodied their nation's belief in perfection and control, and in the end, those machines betrayed them as completely as their leaders had. The Sherman tank that had once been a prisoner of study at Kummersdorf became a strange symbol of that awakening. To those who had tested it, it was more than an enemy artifact, it was a mirror. It reflected what they had refused to see, that a machine could be strong because it was simple, that success could come not from mastery, but from humility. The Germans had built for glory, the Americans had built for endurance, and history had chosen endurance. In the months after surrender, many of the surviving engineers were taken to work for the Allies. Some went to the United States, some to the Soviet Union, and some remained in the ruins of what would become West Germany. They carried with them not only their knowledge, but their shame, and something new, the seed of understanding. For the first time, they saw that the future of engineering could not be ruled by ego. It had to serve humanity, not ideology. It was a painful revelation, but perhaps the most important one of the 20th century. The world that emerged from the war was divided, but also rebuilt. Roads, factories, and cities rose from the rubble, and in their blueprints were the ghosts of past mistakes. The lessons of Kummersdorf shaped everything that followed. The new German tanks, the Leopard, the Farm, and the II, were not monuments to perfection but to balance. Every bolt, every joint, every design choice was made with the same quiet philosophy the Sherman had embodied: reliability over pride. It was as if the defeated had taken the enemy's wisdom and turned it into redemption. There is something profoundly human about that transformation. To lose everything and still find meaning in the loss, to learn from defeat rather than deny it, is a victory of spirit. The German engineers, stripped of their illusions, began to build again, but this time they built differently. Cars that ordinary people could afford, machines that could be repaired by hand, systems that valued longevity over luxury. The war had broken their arrogance, but it had also given them a second chance to create with conscience. When you look at the modern world, the cars on the highway, the turbines in the sky, the machines that shape our lives, you can still trace a line back to that captured tank in 1943. War Daddy 2 was not just a mechanical curiosity. It was a turning point in how humanity thought about technology itself. It taught a generation that brilliance without empathy leads only to destruction, that perfection pursued for its own sake becomes self-destruction, that real strength lies not in domination, but in durability. Even today, the ruins of Kummersdorf remain, overgrown, silent, filled with fragments of iron and forgotten dreams. Tourists who visit say the air feels heavy there, as if the ground still remembers. Somewhere beneath that soil, pieces of the Sherman might still rest, buried under decades of dust. But what it left behind is not rust, it is wisdom, the kind that cannot be manufactured, only earned through suffering. History has a cruel way of teaching. The men who lost the war often understood it better than those who won it. They learned that no empire, no machine, no ideology can outlast the simple truth of human endurance. The same truth that made a mass-produced tank cross deserts, climb hills, and keep moving when everything else fell apart. That truth outlived them all. And perhaps that is what makes this story more than just history. It is a reflection of our own lives. How many times have we built things too complex to sustain, or pursued perfection only to find emptiness? How often have we confused control with strength and pride with purpose? The story of the Sherman and the engineers who studied it is not just about war. It is about us. It is about the human need to understand, to adapt, and to rise again from failure. The end of the Second World War was not the end of conflict. But for many who lived through it, it was the beginning of understanding. The defeated learned something the victors often forget, that failure can purify, that it can strip away illusions until only truth remains. That truth was painful, but it built the modern world more honestly than victory ever could. So when we remember these stories, of machines, of men, of lost causes, we should remember them not as tales of shame, but as lessons of renewal. The German engineers at Kummersdorf did not find redemption in victory, but in acceptance. They discovered that knowledge is not the property of nations, but of humanity itself, that even in loss, there is a way forward. If you followed this story until now, take a moment to reflect on it. Think about how the mistakes of the past continue to shape the machines, systems, and philosophies of the present. Think about what it truly means to learn from history, not to glorify it, but to grow from it. Because in every failure, personal or national, there is the chance to rebuild something better. And if this story made you think, if it made you feel something, or question something, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, click the red button in the corner, and help keep these stories alive. Like this video so more people can find it. And share your thoughts, your questions, or your own experiences in the comments below. You can do it anonymously if you wish. History belongs to all of us, and every voice, yours included, deserves to be heard. Let's keep learning together from the lessons that shape the world.